Hello, everyone. It's Frances Widdowson here. Welcome to the Rational Space Disputations. And with me today, my guest today is Mark Smith, who is a professor of social work at the University of Dundee in Scotland. Anyway, so I welcome to the Rational Space Disputations, Mark.
Thank you, Francis. Thanks for inviting me.
Anyway, just so that people understand the format of the Rational Space Disputations, what happens is that every couple of weeks I invite someone on whose work I find to be very interesting or someone I admire. And then for the first hour, I ask the guest questions. And then after an hour's passed, I turn over the controls to the guest, and the guest asks me questions, just so we can cover off anything that was missed, and as well to sort of right any possible power imbalances that might occur in the interviewing process. Anyway, so Mark, before we get into a lot of these topics, I was wondering if you could just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, what you're working on, what you're interested in, those sorts of things, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I suppose I have to go back to my practice experience, because I was a social worker for almost 20 years, a residential social worker. I worked almost entirely in residential schools. And basically my background prior to that was I was a history graduate, so I've got an interest in history, qualified social worker, and saw myself as having a career in the residential schools. I, was promoted reasonably quickly within that sector. I really enjoyed it, but became really quite concerned about the increased sort of managerial focus on the schools, brought about really, I think, by revelations of abuse within residential childcare and a whole change in focus towards residential care. When it used to be, when I told people what I did, then the response was fairly positive, and they would say, well, that's a really worthy thing to do. That's something you should be proud of. And really quite quickly, that response sort of almost changed to, well, what went on in those places and what have you got to hide? So around about the turn of the millennium, I moved to an academic post. The Scottish Government was setting up a sort of initiative to train, support residential care workers. So I got the post to develop a master's in residential childcare, which is the first master's of its kind in the UK. So I did that successfully for 5 years, moved on to Edinburgh University, and then subsequently up to Dundee. Now, my focus has changed and it's broadened, so I have interests across a number of areas of social work, and I suppose primarily sort of social work ethics, ideas, but a sort of constant has been my interest in residential childcare. And I got sort of involved almost inadvertently in the whole abuse scenario, because I used to play football when I was a residential care worker. In the school I worked in over the course of the 1980s, it was a school that was run by a religious order, actually, the Savile brothers. So we used to play football with a school in England. We would go down there once a year, they would come up to us. And in the UK, the earlier revelations of abuse were in North Wales, and that sort of moved across into England. And the school that we used to play football against got caught up in that. There were about 90 odd staff members who were implicated in abuse. Now, in the event, one was convicted, two were convicted, one won his appeal on that. So one was convicted, but 90 odd staff members were caught up in it. So I started to, so your colleagues of mine said, there's something wrong here, there's something going on. My initial thoughts were to say, well, there must have been something going on, but they were saying no, it's to do with the way that the police sort of interview and the whole pressure to get convictions, and the sort of lure of compensation. I think that was seen as central by a lot of residential workers. Then I read a book called The Secret of Praneston by Richard Webster, who is a cultural historian, and he self-published this book on the North Wales case and the sort of ramifications of that. The North Wales case centred around a school called Praneston. His book was called The Secret of Praneston. His conclusion was that there was no secret at all. It was just, residential care workers going about their task with difficult adolescents. There was nothing much more to it than that. In his book, he deconstructed the Waterhouse Report, which was the government commission of the Tribunal of Inquiry into the North Wales case. And essentially, he showed it up as not a particularly credible document. Brilliant book. And I reviewed it and really got caught up in some of the arguments that Richard sort of took forward. And Richard was also involved when there were claims made in the island of Jersey and Haute de la Graine, and there was talk of children's remains, buried in the grounds of the children's home. And massive press coverage, and there was a local detective with his dog who was sort of pictured as being the force of good against the forces of evil, which the children's home represented. Now, Richard actually exposed some of these, what were said to be skull fragments, as pieces of wood or coconut, and really knocked the whole sort of Haute de la Graine sort of story for six. Of course, that sort of trundled on, and everybody since who has abused kids is said to have sort of turned up at Haute de la Graine. So when the allegations against Jimmy Savile emerged, then there was talk of him having been at Haute de la Graine as well. No evidence, of course. But so I started to write about this, thinking that,
So just what was the time frame? So I'm just trying to kind of piece together about what time frame was all of these kinds of sexual abuse kinds of allegations coming to light.
Yeah, in mostly the 90s, but then, ever since. The Waterhouse Report was 2000. Richard Webster's book came out, I think, in 2005.
Okay. And the Waterhouse Report, it was a government kind of commission that was formed?
It was very interesting because there had been a whistleblower, social worker, who made these claims out of the blue, really, because anything that we knew previously was that she had had good experiences in these institutions, but made these claims of abuse in the institutions. They were investigated by the police at least twice, and the police found nothing there. But of course, a head of steam built up, and then the police became accused of covering up, and there was talk of Masonic conspiracies and whatever else, and paedophile rings. So the whole sort of mood became one of conspiracy and cover-up. So they started another investigation and managed to find a couple of guys to convict, I think. And then the whole sort of focus spread out, and Waterhouse was brought in as a tribunal of inquiry. It's the highest level of government inquiry to investigate the claims of a paedophile ring and what was going on in children's homes in North Wales.
Yeah, this is a very interesting area that is taking, and I think there might be some, like a timing similarity with this coming to light. As you
Yeah.
know, in Canada, and this is kind of how we connected with one another, is the current research that I'm doing on the Canadian case with the Indigenous residential schools. So in your view, so it seems to me, I don't know if this is correct interpretation, but there's a large kind of outpouring of concern, but there doesn't seem to be very many substantiated cases of abuse. Is that what you're finding?
Yes, in the scheme of things, there are very few substantiated cases. And I would argue that many of those cases which are substantiated have question marks over them as well. I think there are a number of wrongful convictions.
And why is this, in your view, what's driving this? Or if it's like, this is, I have to kind of qualify this because it just seems to me to be such a difficult area, because how can we really know for sure whether abuse has taken place or not in most of these cases? Like, it's really kind of it's one of those things, and you almost feel like a terrible person just for raising the question, because it's now, here you've got people who obviously have some effects, psychological effects from whatever has happened. They're making these claims, and to question that is to sort of cast doubt on the obvious suffering of some kind that these people are, that the people that are making these claims are doing. So it's almost like it's a very difficult thing to kind of enter into a questioning process of, because
absolutely, yeah, and you're threatening the identities of those who are making those claims, because many of them have identified as sort of victims of abuse. My own understanding of it, or interpretation of it, would be very often that, yeah, they have had difficult experiences in their lives, and this narrative of having been abused in residential childcare gives them something to hang those experiences on.
Yeah.
And I think the distance and the different practices allows people to be able to say, well, that happened to me. And it probably happened to just about every other kid in that sort of era as well. But it gives something to hang present day distress or doubt upon. And there are incentives to sort of identify as having been abused in care.
So how does one properly investigate these kinds of circumstances? I guess, like, this is a very difficult area. The truth, to some extent, maybe can never be actually known, because it's relying upon testimonies of people, and those testimonies will depend upon a variety of factors, and it's often done in circumstances where things are private, behind closed doors, if they did occur. So there's not going to, it's unlikely that there's going to be witnesses. And so in your view, is there better or worse ways to investigate these kinds of circumstances?
I think a good starting point would be to actually investigate, because there are times, there are sort of situations where claims have been made where the victim or survivor was not even in the residential sort of home in question, or certainly wasn't in at the same time as the man. It's generally men that they're making allegations against. So some sort of basic investigatory techniques would actually, I think, sort of knock out a large number of these cases. But the difficulty, or one of the difficulties, is that, as you say, you're dealing with testimony. I'm not sure that there are no witnesses in residential school situations.
Mm.
You know, it's a bit of a goldfish bowl. There were up to 100 kids. When I started in 1981, there were 60 kids in the school I was in. There was always a couple of staff around at least.
Mm.
It's far more public than foster care, for instance. So,
Mm.
you know, the opportunity to do things was there, but, you know, there was a chance that you would get caught, I would have thought, you know, that somebody
Mm.
would see. So, but the, you know, this investigation, I think, doesn't happen for a couple of reasons. One, I think the police have found themselves accused of not taking such claims seriously. So they are keen not to come in for that kind of publicity. But there's also been a sort of shift in the law where there's greater acceptance of testimony of like kind or evidence of like kind. So once you bundle a few similar stories together, then they can be seen to corroborate one another. So you get an incentive for the police to actually get a number of stories which sound similar in order to be prosecuted. And people are convicted on the basis of, you know, similar accounts, without any other evidence, without any smoking gun, without any blood on the carpet, or,
Mm.
you know, any of what we would traditionally consider to be evidence.
And what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with that approach of seeing, you know, of having these similar stories? Like, that seems to be one method of corroborating things, or are there problems with that?
I think there are problems with it because it is intended that these are independent accounts, that people don't know one another. But
Mm.
increasingly, when you've got all these victim groups, when you've got the prospect of compensation, when you've got the internet and social media generally, then
Yes.
you know the possibility of independent accounts becomes compromised.
Yes.
But I think the other thing, you know, in sort of epistemological terms, I think, you know, qualitative research would suggest that just a number of people telling the same story doesn't necessarily corroborate that story in and of itself.
Mm.
But the other thing I think for me is that what you've got are, in some cases, damaged individuals who are trying to make sense of their lives. And I think that, you know, one of the areas that I'm pursuing is the power of stories and how people can be inclined to write themselves into sort of dominant narrative or cultural scripts. So when you've got a cultural script out there is that everybody in residential childcare was abused, that schools and homes were institutionally abusive, then people start to say, well, maybe that happened to me too. So you know, people are writing themselves into this cultural script without sufficient context. So there are a number of, I think, difficulties with the sort of practice of using evidence of like kind.
Yes. So it seems to me, just looking at, and because of course we're dealing with this in a number of different countries, and it seems to have the time, seems to be coming, I guess it was in the 80s that this started. Is that correct? Like the 80s was when we had basically the satanic abuse sorts of things start to emerge in the United States.
Yeah.
Linked to a book called Michelle Remembers. That's one of the most well-known circumstances, although it's probably got more inputs than that. But and then we sort of saw this to some extent spreading out, and other kind of areas kind of having this occur as well. And I know historically there's been incidents of things like this coming to the surface. is there any, have you sort of looked into kind of the causes of this, or what's sort of driving these kinds of these things arising in society?
Yeah, David Frankfurter, who's a theology professor, I think, in North Boston, I think. He's written a book called Speak of the Devil, and he sort of identifies a recurring sort of theme throughout history of seeing children as under threat and needing to be protected. And there are these periodic episodes, and Frank Furedi, a sociologist, would sort of claim they're not episodes anymore. It's more a crusade. It's not a sort of moral panic. It's been ongoing for the last, since the 80s, as you say. And I think the origins were the sort of McMartin, the Michelle remembers stuff in the 1980s. I think we had a couple of situations in the UK where there was the focus on the family. So there were big sort of signal cases, Cleveland in the north of England, the Orkney Islands in Scotland, where social workers basically, created mass panics around satanic abuse within family situations. And the response was questioned and questionable. And some of the literature sort of suggests that the focus then moved away from the family as the focus of satanic abuse towards residential care, which by this stage was on the wane anyway. And some of what had been residential care run by religious orders, the religious orders were beginning to die off. The whole focus in social work was to deinstitutionalize, to move away from residential childcare. So this notion of large institutions, often set apart from centres of population, run by religious orders, they seemed anachronistic. People, I think, started to imagine awful things must be happening there. And the focus of satanic abuse, I think, sort of shifted towards the schools. The focus on the family sort of dissipated as a result of a book by Professor Jean Lafontaine at, I think it's the London School of Economics, and she dismissed the whole satanic abuse controversy, but it didn't go away, it sort of shifted.
Yeah.
And this desire to find child abuse shifted onto residential childcare.
And there seems to be a little bit of an opposition to institutions. Like that seems to be part of it as well, is that we become kind of suspicious of institutions. And in Canada, there were institutions that looked after, for example, the mentally ill and so on. I'm thinking of the one who flew over the cuckoo's nest, like that sort of idea that these institutions are these kinds of very cold, draconian places, and we should really just kind of get rid of them and then, basically release people into the community is almost kind of the kind of justification for that. And of course, what we would see after that is just a lot of people kind of roaming the street, and mentally ill people roaming the streets because they didn't have that kind of institutionalized kind of routine that would enable them to be kind of looked after, I guess. So it sort of seems to me somewhat of a justification for deinstitutionalization of circumstances, which I don't know, it's kind of an open question. Are institutions really needed in some of these kinds of circumstances?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. because I think that the emerging social work profession in the UK was sort of professionalised in the late 60s, but it drew a lot of its sort of theoretical sort of drive from sociologists such as Irving Goffman and some of the sort of anti-psychiatry movement as well. So yeah, the one flew over the cuckoo's nest idea sort of painted a particular picture of the institution as bad, and that chimed with the sort of emerging social work ideology, because a lot of social work was built around deinstitutionalizing, keeping people in communities. And that obviously is legitimate if people can be supported in communities. As you say, it hasn't always happened particularly well. But the institution almost became an easy punching bag for society when they were trying to sort of shift away from institutional care. I'm not sure it was deliberate, but I can see that connection between the desire to close institutions and the discovery of abuse within institutions.
And a little bit as well, and this is something I think your work touches on, sort of the relativism. Like in the 60s, we started to have relativism, a whole relativistic postmodern kind of developments, where the idea of there being kind of a universal way of looking at things, or at least we were striving to develop a universal understanding, that got challenged by postmodernism and various kinds of aspects. And I think institutionalizing things has a kind of a universal conception of what things should be like. So, for example, the mentally ill have difficulties. This is kind of the universalist position, and you're trying to find mechanisms which will allow them to become as quote unquote normal. Like even the word normal is now like you sort of feel slightly cautious about using it, but not as have little as of the mental illnesses they can possibly have. Now it's, well, is it really mental illness and just another way of living in the world? And who are you as a social scientist or a medical professional or a social worker, whatever, to kind of make judgments about this as being mentally ill, as opposed to something which is just another way of living in the world. And I think this is sort of wrapped up with this a little bit.
Yeah. There's weird things going on, not weird, but a number of things coming together, I think, in this, because I think there's a tendency to try and move away from the experts within society as well, to say that people are experts in their own lives, to look towards lived experience rather than any sort of expert experience. But in a sort of medical sense, I think probably rightly ask questions of an overly medical discourse, an overly psychiatric discourse, and to see the roots of people's distress in some social circumstances. And I think there's a legitimate argument for that, and I would probably see myself in that side, but there's a halfway house, and I think some of that is almost turning to this notion of looking not to medical science, but to sort of scientism, mostly based around psychology, clinical psychology. So the dominant theme, for instance, just now is around trauma. So it's about psychologizing distress as far as I'm concerned, but it claims not to shift the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Now, if you think about the implications of that, then if you're saying to people who are distressed, then they're distressed because of something that happened to them, then they're starting to think, well, what might have happened to me to cause this distress? And that's invariably sort of then starts to focus on what happened interpersonally, rather than, well, actually, I'm in a bad way because, you know, my family had no money, because I can't find a job, because of any of the sort of structural issues in society. Those are almost pushed aside in this sort of focus on what happened to you. What did somebody do to you that caused you to be, you know, be the way you are just now? Whereas, you know, historically, I think we would have looked for more sort of structural or sociological explanations, but the explanations that we're looking for from the, you know, now for personal distress are interpersonal, individual.
Yeah, you mentioned the legal profession. I wanted to ask you about that. Is what role do you see the legal profession playing in many of these circumstances?
I think they've driven the whole thing, and it's not an honourable position for the legal profession, I don't think. For me, I think you've got two sets of lawyers. You've got the personal injury lawyers who are encouraging people to sort of come up with claims of having been abused, that they're going into prisons, putting posters up on prisons saying, "Were you ever abused? Come and see us." They're advertising, you know, for people to come forward having been abused. And it's always struck me as a bit odd that if you were suffering from the effects of abuse, any sort of traumatic, if you want to use that word, effects, that you would go to a lawyer rather than a sort of psychologist or a doctor. But you know, the channel to a professional is through lawyers. So you've got some very tawdry legal practice at that level of personal injury law. You've got firms moving into that area, very specifically seeing it as a business venture, and some really dodgy practice, I think. And of course, what they do is you under this provision to find, you know, similar stories as corroborating one another, then it becomes a sort of site for these stories to be corroborated and then taken to the police. So that's one level of sort of legal involvement in this. Another is a sort of more global sort of level, and that's the influence of human rights law and the sort of transformation of human rights laws into something which ought to be therapeutic, if you like. And that's where it links to trauma, that I think, you know, people are claimed to have been abused, they need redress, they're traumatized by this abuse, they need redress. So one thing sort of feeds into another. I think you've got whole layers of probably well-motivated lawyers that, you know, not so much like the sort of personal injury lawyers, many of whom are just out to, you know, to garner business. I think this notion of human rights, people think that they're doing a really wonderful thing in terms of bringing all these abuses to the fore and allowing redress. Ronald Neeson has a very good article, I think, in which he really questions the conflation of human rights with therapy. It doesn't work, you know, and it's also, I would argue, not legitimate.
So why?
One of the things that strikes me is that, you know, you've got these small victim groups. I'm thinking of Scotland, small groups who are able to retain the services of a top lawyer. And I'm thinking, how on earth does that happen? Now, it can only happen if the state actually facilitate that, or if legal firms are, encouraging that. But I do think that generally lawyers are driving so much of this whole dynamic.
Yes. And so I just wanted to get into this a little bit with you about the human rights and therapy and trauma. You're saying, as far as I understand, what you're saying is that the sort of the human rights, the idea of human rights doesn't fit very well with this kind of therapeutic kind of idea. Is that correct?
Sorry, I'm just putting my phone off. I don't think it is. I think that there's been this notion created that just bringing something out into the open, having the opportunity to be listened to be accepted, to have your story accepted. Now that's difficult in itself because it assumes that the story is true. But this notion that somehow or other, just that climate of openness and of people accepting your story actually has some cathartic effect. It allows you to move on, to get that story out there, to move on in your life. Now, the reality of that is that it's just as likely to freeze dry that story, to sort of trap you in this cycle of constantly reiterating the whole story. You don't move on. I don't think that human rights legitimation of telling your story is actually helpful for those who tell those stories. They end up just going around in a circle.
Yeah, so the human rights, no, but so what is the actual human rights aspect of this? It is being seen as being an individual with dignity and so on, and you have a right to be heard. Is that kind of the human rights side of it?
Well, I think for me, there's two sides. One is that you have a right not to be tortured or subject to inhuman treatment. And of course, what might have been everyday discipline then becomes cast as torture. And then if you've been subject to that, then you're entitled to redress, which is another sort of human rights sort of item. The difficulty is, I think, they pick and choose, which sort of elements of human rights legislation that they actually sort of turn to, because I don't hear too many of them saying that you shouldn't be subject to retrospective justice, and investigated for practices that wouldn't have been considered to be illegal, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And yet that is very often happening.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think this idea of, first of all, telling your story. So there's a demand that everyone believe it.
Yeah.
Which is slightly, seems to me to be forcing your audience into a particular, like, I'm just kind of wondering a little bit about the human rights. What about the human rights of your audience to think for themselves and to maybe doubt whatever it is that you are putting forward, like, or at least be kind of waiting for the evidence to come out? But there seems to be pressure about that as well. I think there is something there, what you're talking about, that it seems to me the people who are telling their stories, they don't seem to really, many that I see doing this, it doesn't seem to have a beneficial effect for them.
It doesn't at all. Partly, well, for a whole number of reasons. I actually believe that most kids who have been in residential care actually have some conscience. And I think it's an awful thing to have on your conscience that you have given evidence that has led somebody to be jailed. And there may be questions about whether the evidence you gave may have been embellished, may have been exaggerated, may have been fabricated. And
Yeah.
some of it is fabricated. I've been in cases where, as I say, the complainant has not even been in the institution that they're complaining around and complaining about. But you're told to believe that, because if you don't believe that, then you're preventing other people from coming forward. That seems to be a powerful sort of maxim, that if you don't believe victims, then you're putting the stops on other people being able to tell their stories. So that sort of is a disincentive, I think, or it's cast as a disincentive to disbelieve.
Yeah. You mentioned one person who I was quite intrigued by, Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
Because I watched, I guess it was on Netflix or something like this. I don't know anything
Oh, yeah.
about the Jimmy Savile cases except for what I've seen. I'm just curious as to what you've done some research on the Jimmy Savile case.
Yeah, it's one of these ones that you think, what's the connection? Why would I get involved in Jimmy Savile? For anybody that's not from the UK, Jimmy Savile was probably one of the most popular disc jockeys, popular entertainers over the 60s, 70s, maybe into the 80s in the UK. Personally, I didn't, I found him a bit of an odd character. I didn't, take to him at all. But he died and was sort of lauded for his charity work. And then a year later, there was a documentary which claimed he was a sexual predator. There are all sorts of question marks to be asked about the provenance of this documentary, actually, and the people who were driving it. But anyway, one thing led to another, and all of a sudden you've got a whole, hundreds of outpouring of claims of abuse against Savile. And it became an incredibly politicized sort of issue, used really to sort of shift, approaches to criminal justice in the case of sort of sexual offences. But how I got involved was, and again, it's to do with my connection with residential childcare. I had, by this stage, with a couple of colleagues at Edinburgh, done some work on moral panics, revisiting some of the sort of sociological literature on moral panics, around about 2015-16 or something. And we had a seminar series and we edited a book on moral panics. And then a colleague of mine got an email out of the blue from this woman who blogged under the sort of name of Anna Raccoon. Now, Anna Raccoon was a former had been in residential childcare. And it was a school in the south of England called Duncroft, which was a home office school, an experimental school to try and treat girls who had gone off the rails differently, more humanely, to try and get them back on the tracks educationally, to try and understand them. In many ways, it's a very progressive institution. A lot of money went into it, psychiatrists from some of the top hospitals. And it's really quite successful, well regarded in its day. But it took sort of girls who had gone off the rails, but looked for girls who were quite intelligent so that they could intervene educationally. Now, Anna Raccoon was there in the mid-60s, and she went on to do very well. She became a lawyer, then retired, and retired to France, and she started to blog, and she was a terrific writer, great blogger actually, really acerbic and sort of, to the point, forensic. Then she started to read about the Savile case and thought, well, that's Duncroft they're talking about. And one of the women who was making allegations, she said, well, I know her, I shared a dormitory with her. And that was in 1966, and I never ever saw Jimmy Savile in Duncroft. And the reality was, we discovered that Savile never actually set foot in Duncroft until 1974. So a lot of the early claims against Savile were sort of, didn't happen. He wasn't in Duncroft. So Anna Raccoon started to sort of explore further into the claims made in the Savile case, and was blogging on a very regular basis. And she got in touch and said, look, I've got all this mound of information on the Savile case. It really needs to be safeguarded. It needs to be a book written on it. And I would do it myself, but on borrowed time. I've got cancer. I don't have long to live. So I want to pass over this information to you. Now, the Economic and Social Research Council at the time was put out a call for urgent research. So I managed to get some money from them to safeguard all this material. We did some interviews with former pupils at Duncroft and with former staff members. And yeah, I did try and do a book. I put in a couple of proposals to publishers and got knocked back. Funnily enough. And the article that we did get published, we were round the houses with that as well. People don't really want to know. They don't want to know the other side of the Savile case. Now, Savile was the question is to what extent his behaviour was inappropriate, to what extent it was criminal. It was, looking back, you think, geez, how did he get away with that? And it was inappropriate. But a lot of the claims that were being made don't stack up. The evidence for them is not strong.
And I have to admit, feeling slightly ashamed, because I found him a bit of a creep. Like, that was my own, like, I found him a bit of a creep. So because I found him a bit of a creep, it was like, okay, well, I'll just accept whatever people are saying when, it's true. Like, he probably was a bit of a creep, but that doesn't mean he's guilty of all these allegations that have been made against him. And I think this presumption of, like, this is one of the biggest difficulties perhaps facing this area, is we have as a fundamental principle of our society the presumption of innocence. And the whole discourse around many of these kinds of allegations of abuse is to throw that out, because if you don't believe people, you are claimed to be traumatizing them or re-traumatizing them, like all over again, is sort of thing. And that is I think people should really, really think carefully about where this is all going. Certainly, we want to make sure people are held to account for their behavior, but that doesn't mean not having putting in place protections to make sure that people are not falsely accused of doing things that they didn't do.
The interesting thing about Savile, of course, he was never brought to a court of law, so there was never any sort of due process attached to his case. He was essentially found guilty in a report by the Metropolitan Police and a children's charity. Now, that's really worrying that a police force and a children's charity can come together to claim this is the biggest sexual predator we've ever come across, without investigating any of the claims in any of the detail that would actually stand up in court. Worrying. And that's where, another criticism of human rights lawyers, that they've allowed that to happen. There's not been an outpouring of sort of concern about the fact that we have done away with any sort of due process. But the Savile case is, it's the one that's used to legitimize just about everything else that is done in these situations.
So in terms of the response, to your work, I'm interested, like, have you had, or people been very, very critical of you raising these concerns? What kind of reaction have you got to these kinds of questions that you've been raising about, due process and the whole moral panics area? Because I know we're going to get into this shortly with my own experience, but there is kind of a discouragement of pursuing these lines of inquiry, and I'm wondering what sort of has been the reaction to the research you've been doing?
Yeah, it's probably not been a good career move. the, I would probably consider that I'm one of the, and I've got an international reputation in child and youth care, residential child care, but it's profits in their own land. Nobody asks me anything about it in Scotland anymore. I mean, I did set up the Masters in Residential Childcare. The very successful program I'm still running. A number of people that I've taught respect me and respect my views, and probably go along with them. And most residential workers know that there are false allegations. And they've seen them, and they've seen the consequences of those. But it's hard to sort of speak out. I think probably the reason I do is that I know too much, and I know just how bad some of these cases are. People think, well, there must be something in it. A jury wouldn't convict if the evidence wasn't really compelling. And so you think, well, especially if it's at that distance, 30 years ago, they must have been really convinced. The evidence must have been strong. I've seen the evidence, and as I say, a lot of the evidence doesn't even locate the complainant and the person who's having a complaint made against them in the same place at the same time. It's terrifying how flimsy some of this evidence is.
Yeah, and this is for actual convictions that have happened.
Yeah.
And so how does that happen within a court case, so that this absolutely terrible evidence is not dealt with and refuted and so on? How does that go on in like, I understand with the Savile case, because he's dead anyway, so he's not there to defend himself. It seems like it's cruel to question people and so on, and we're believing victims, and like I can sort of see why the Savile case wasn't really treated with sort of the kind of rigor that it should have been treated with. But in a court of law, you have all these protections in place. So how does that happen in an actual court case where this is
because it's very hard to defend those cases, because whilst there's no evidence for the crime, there's also no exculpatory evidence either. The people who may have been witnesses are often dead. The sort of books, the recordings are often lost, one way or another. You can't get access to anything that you'd be able to use to provide a defense case. I think another thing is that, you've got jurors who are often of a very different generation, who don't have that historical sensibility to realize that actually sometimes kids did get a slap across the ear or kick up the backside. There were instances where corporal punishment of some sort was used. Privacy was not what it would be now. There were situations which from a distance you think those must be awful places. My own experience was that they were not. They were really positive places for the most part. But so you've got that contextual factor. But the other thing you've got is all this, the jury can, or the conviction can take place on jury's belief in the testimonies corroborating one another. So you've got all these similar stories, and you think something went on, so you've got 2 or 3 stories that are saying the same thing, so guilty. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's once you get taken into the court system, then I wouldn't fancy people's chances.
Yeah, and the memory, this is another thing which is very, very important in these cases, and something that I'm working on myself, is people don't have a very good understanding that memory is not reliable.
Yeah.
You know, like, and this is something everyone should be very conscious of, is that we think of our memories as being like a, you know, a recorded disc or something in our brain.
Yeah.
When memory, it depends upon often how you recollect your memory. So
Yeah.
if you recollect your memory in a context where you're feeling very upset and so on, your memory can be changed to suit, you know, the circumstances which you're currently in. And that's
Yeah.
not, you know, this whole idea, and that's why it's so scary when we have all these demands, you know, we believe you and so on. In my own circumstances, like I'm never accusing anyone of lying about anything. Like, I
Yeah.
don't think lying is the issue. It's just, if you have a memory and it's recalled in various contexts, that memory is not going to be the same as before you recalled it within that context. And that's not, you know, and I know eyewitness kind of accounts and so on are a big thing in trials, and that's not all that reliable, this kind of evidence. And I think that's perhaps a big problem as well, is that we're not really kind of accepting that this kind of form of evidence can be quite inaccurate.
Well, it's no, absolutely. Elizabeth Loftus has done some great work on memory. Yeah.
Yeah.
The what happens, I think, well, one, the courts tend not to look at science of memory in coming to their. I think it's hard for a defence to actually say, you know, I'm bringing a memory expert. I did have. I was aware of a case where the prosecution brought in a memory expert, or he wasn't an expert actually, and he gave this thing about therapeutic memory and how, or traumatic memory, and how, you know, memories could be forgotten and then brought back, you know, triggered by something down the line. Now, most sort of bona fide memory experts would question that as well, actually, and say, if something traumatic has happened to you, you don't actually put it away in a box for 30 years, you know. So there is, I think, a need to really address questions of memory in your court situations and in these cases more generally.
Yeah.
And we don't.
Yes. Well, speaking of memory and research on memory, we've reached the hour point, and so I'm just going to turn the controls over to you, and we can either continue on this line of inquiry, or we can look at other things, whatever you think is best for the next hour.
Okay. I don't know if I've got an hour's worth of questions, but I suspect this conversation could go on anyway. So, I mean, when you say you're handing the controls over to me, I don't have to do anything, do I?
No, you just have to ask his questions. Just ask the questioning process.
Okay. No, I was really pleased to come across your work. I think through Jaime Rubinstein's.
Yes.
I was aware of some of the Canadian sort of situation, because some of the early historical abuse stuff or institutional abuse stuff was it Mount St. John's Cashel or something in Nova Scotia, and then there was a Kaufman report, and then I did come across Ronald Neeson's work, so it was great to see Rubinstein's work and then through his viewers. And it just seems to sort of ring a real bell with me. Could you maybe explain, just to start off, how you, as an economist, got involved in this?
Yeah, so, well, I'm a political scientist. I've been involved in studying Indigenous policy since, I guess, 1995. So that was when I was working for the government of the Northwest Territories. I was critically analyzing what was called the traditional knowledge policy and the various claims that are being made about that, which were it was being claimed that traditional knowledge could really help us to understand the impacts of a diamond mine, and this seemed to be largely being made to extract compensation, various forms of compensation from the government. So I was working with Albert Howard, and I've written quite a few things with Albert Howard, and we started to understand the kind of manipulation that was happening with respect to Indigenous policy generally. A group that Albert and I, called the Aboriginal industry, which is largely lawyers, and that's why I was so interested in your comments about the lawyers, is a lot of it was driven by lawyers and various legal cases and so on. Albert and I, when we wrote our book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, we had a couple of pages on the residential schools. And this was when the residential schools, and it wasn't very often, but there was a couple of authors who were referring to them as genocide, the residential schools. And we referred to that then, and this was in, I guess, around 2005 that we were in this chapter, as hysterical claims about genocide, because, like, it really didn't make any sense that you would, like, here where you had a school system set up, and it had lots of draconian characteristics, no doubt. It was neglectful in various ways, and there's all sorts of problems, but it was trying to give Indigenous peoples the skills so that they could enter into the capitalist economy. Like, it was a response to the the collapse of various economic features in the fur trade and so on. So we were just kind of going, how could people argue that this is genocide when, like, genocide is when you're trying to exterminate a group. It's not you're providing anything. So that was the response. That was in 2005. And I really wasn't very involved in the residential schools, except for that just short kind of foray. And then in 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report came out, and I was shocked at the kinds of claims that were being made and the sort of pressure that was being placed upon people to accept. Like, it was seen almost as a sacred text. Like, you would hear people say, well, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has argued this, therefore, we must do all these things in the university. I was going, wow, this needs a little bit more critical analysis. And it was kind of funny because I remember talking to some colleagues that I was going to do a paper on the residential schools. I was going to investigate. So they're going, oh, don't do that. Oh, no. And then I was at a roundtable. I organized a roundtable with one of my colleagues, Liam Haggerty. And I used the residential schools as one example of the problem of indigenization. So we started to do this thing of indigenization of the university. And one of the examples I used was, the kind of contamination of historical research, like the pressure, the advocacy pressure that was being put on research, and the residential schools was one of them. And this roundtable was one of the big incidents that was kind of a sign of what was going to come for my case. And I remember being there giving this presentation, and I had the residential schools as one of the examples on my PowerPoints. And this audience, it was a very unruly audience, and people were screaming from the audience, "Be careful," to me when I was going to be talking about the residential schools. So it was a very hot button topic, but I thought it really needed more critical analysis. And then I did write a paper in 2017 for the Canadian Political Science Association, which became 2 chapters in a book that's critical of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from Truth Comes Reconciliation by Rodney Clifton and Mark DeWolf. So that was, and then, so that was kind of the background. And then in 2020, that's when the universities really started to, or my own university made a declaration that genocide had been perpetrated against Indigenous people, which I was very opposed to. And then in 2021, we had the moral panic start to happen with respect to the Kamloops case. And now I am becoming an expert on the Kamloops case. Like that's my one, I'm going to just focus on, because that's what started off the hysteria. And so I'm going to really, and I'm writing a book on the Kamloops case and all the failures of all the various disciplines that allowed this hysteria to just basically, just explode throughout the Canadian system.
Right, fascinating. There's going to be a book, brilliant. It seems that the Kamloops case, picks up on, I've got this notion of traveling knowledge, that the same sort of, concerns emerge across the globe, don't they? Certainly across the Anglophone world. And this notion of kids being buried seems to be in shallow graves or whatever else. It was around in the Hope de la Garenne case, in a number of the Irish residential schools, Letterfrack, Artane, and in Tuam in Galway, sent 215 kids or 70 kids or kids' bodies hidden in a sewage tank or something like that, I don't think there's ever been any evidence of any of these bodies being there, is there?
Well, and I was going to ask you, because someone mentioned to me the case of the Irish children, like I guess it was for unwed mothers. Has there ever been any bodies discovered in the Irish case?
No, it's like the Kamloops case. There's not been any excavation of these bodies. It was based on a couple of local guys having said that they saw some, a couple of children's bodies in this sewage, but then they're retracting now as well. But the assumption is that these bodies are there or were there. That story was put out into the press. It's not really been sort of challenged particularly, but there's been no excavation and no bodies actually found.
It's interesting because when I was talking to one of my colleagues about this, and she was mentioning when the Kamloops case was first announced, she thought it was true. And she told me because in Ireland, there were all these bodies found in Ireland, like these children's bodies. And I didn't know. And so it's kind of accepted as being true that there were these children's bodies found in Ireland. When now and I didn't investigate it, I didn't know whatever. So I was kind of harboring in my own mind that there had been a case where hundreds of children's bodies, and I assumed it had been, babies who had died, like infant mortality was quite high,
exactly.
Or whatever. But still, it's not clandestine. When you have a stillborn baby, you don't go into an apple orchard and bury it, but anyway. So that's another kind of piece of misinformation which is percolating out there. The Kamloops case is just it's a really interesting case in its own right, and we're still piecing it. So I'm working with a research. So Jaime Rubenstein is a member of this research group that I am involved with, collaborating with. And there's a number of very, very important people in this research group. Perhaps the most important is Nina Green, who is a hotshot, unbelievable IF Stone figure she just ferrets out all this. And my piece, Billy Remembers, was based upon her. Like she had done all the research. And at that time, she didn't want to be known as she didn't want her name publicly known, but now she's been writing some things herself. So she has an amazing research ability. But the bodies, when it first broke, one of my colleagues said that, she spent the night crying, an Indigenous colleague, because of the 215 murdered children, which had occurred in Canada. And like I was saying, well, if there are, because there's cemeteries. So this is what people don't understand, is that there's a number of cemeteries that are often quite close to residential schools. Sometimes they were the community cemetery. And there's many unmarked graves in these cemeteries because the crosses that were identifying the remains, they've disintegrated and they're no longer there. So when it first came out, it wasn't clear whether this was a cemetery, what they were talking about, where the cross is blown away. So that was the first question. But then it turned out, no, it is this orchard. And so we're still waiting on this one, but it seems highly improbable that these are burials there. And Nina Green and another anonymous person whose name is by the pseudonym Cam Rez, who has a website called Graves in the Apple Orchard. He's a specialist in aerial photography. They've been basically revealing all sorts of excavations that have been happening at the Kamloops, site since 1917. The most important being a sewage system. So there was a bunch of tiles and pipes and things like that were excavated. That evidently does not appear to have been flagged in the ground penetrating radar report, which has not been made public. So right now, the major kind of push is that this report, which was done by Sarah Beaulieu for the band, that report must be made public so that we can look at her findings and see if her findings considered all the excavations that had previously happened on that site. But the band is keeping that report private, and that's just unacceptable, is that there should be massive pressure for that report to be made public so we can take a look at it. And then once we take a look at that report, then we can start pressuring for the excavations. But of course, the excavations, all these Indigenous activists and their quote unquote allies are saying, oh, you're demanding to see the bodies of dead children, and Indigenous people don't owe you, to get, and it's like this is just pure, evidence. Like, it's just a question of evidence. Like, what are you talking about? But the report, releasing the report, doesn't even require excavations, but they're not even doing that. So it seems going to be an uphill battle to try to get this to come out.
It's fascinating because in the Irish cases, one of the things that the residential schools did very well was they were meticulous in record keeping. In the schools that I worked in, you could, every admission and every discharge was actually meticulously recorded. So I don't know where they got these 200 kids from that they managed to sort of bury or take off the register, because those registers in many cases still exist. The other thing that gets me is that, a lot of the schools would have been run by religious, but the proportions of religious reduced over the years, and there was lay teachers, lay sort of care staff, but the women who did the cooking and the cleaning and the handymen, they were all local people who were sort of coming in. So it depends on that massive conspiracy of silence, doesn't it?
And in the Kamloops case, there was a number of Indigenous school teachers as well. And it's, in terms of the records, this is another interesting thing, because it's true. They had all these records and everything, but the government at some point destroyed some of these records because of space making requirements or whatever. So I don't think it was any kind of, and this sort of shows you how dangerous it is to kind of get rid of any of these historical documents, like it, because it kind of removes from the historian's kind of toolkit the ability to piece together what happened historically. So at some point, the government basically threw out a whole bunch of these records, and now it's been claimed, of course, it was a cover up and so on and so forth. But I think that was relatively early. Like, I think that the records for I think the 1950s and the 1960s, which is the kind of the period in Kamloops that we're talking about, like that's the claim, is that in the 1950s and the 60s, that was when these burials are claimed to have occurred. And I think that those records are largely intact. The difficulty is that they're in kind of separate kinds of locations. Yeah. And as well, there were fires in some schools. So some of the records were destroyed in fires. And then now, of course, we have a push by the indigenous groups that, they're the only ones who should have access to these records and so on. Like there's a lot of, kind of political battles that go on in archival and archaeological kinds of contexts, where indigenous groups are now claiming they should be the ones who are the the holders of the records, which of course is going to be a disaster for any kind of universal kind of research, because no one really should own the past. It's like, in order for us to have any confidence about the accuracy of, archaeological research or historical research, everything should just be opened to the public, certainly after 50 years or whatever. Like, I understand, there's sometimes sensitive information, but still, it should be open and accessible to everyone.
Yeah. So you've had hostile reception.
Yep. Yeah. So, and we're right now in kind of a period of flux. So the residential schools, starting in 2017, which is when I wrote this paper for the Canadian Political Science Association. That's when, it started a bit earlier than that, but this was when there was kind of the mob that was going to go after me was starting to kind of become organized. And
it is organized, isn't it? It
was kind of there was separate kind of murmurings that it might be a good idea if I was no longer Mount Royal. So the Students Association, this is one of the worst kinds of elements in many university campuses, is these students associations, which used to be, in favor of free speech and now are totalitarian. Anyway, the head of the Students Association, whose name is Shifra Gadamzeti, who is a very, reified postmodernist, woke kind of element, was saying that, when I wrote this paper, there was a hit job that came out in this publication called Canada Land, which is known as a kind of scurrilous kind of publication. And I didn't even bother to write a response or anything, because I didn't take it seriously. It was so out over the top and outrageous. Anyway, so Ms. Gadamzeti reposted this piece and said, this is terrible. Mount Royal needs better educators than this, or something like that. So I immediately wrote her an email, CC'd to the administration, just kind of sort of saying to her, like, and I didn't want to, again, this is my whole approach, is I never wanted to say, you shouldn't say the things that you do, or you should be punished or something. I would say, look, I don't think you have a good understanding of my research, and I would be happy to do a presentation or anything for the Students Association. That was the kind of thing. So I was trying to kind of manage what I perceived to be an attempt to kind of bring together forces to try to get me fired. And I recognized this quite early, and I was trying to protect myself from this. in the end, it was unsuccessful due to harassment and human rights policies. So this is going to be the big battle is, is making comments on your private social media account, which is basically this, my whole thing is about this. Is that what constitutes harassment and discrimination in the law? That's going to be what's going to be arbitrated in January, on January 16th. And I just had a discussion with Gad Sad, who's a psychologist from Concordia, and he was going, well, obviously not. Like, obviously your social media, your private social media activity is not something that your employer should be concerning itself with. That's your rights as a private citizen to be able to say things. It's like, well, that is a huge issue that has to be, that there has to be a decision supporting that kind of obvious situation, but that hasn't happened yet. So we're still, we're going to have to fight this one out. And Mount Royal is certainly under the impression, based upon the investigators that it hired. So it hired 4, or more than that, but 4 investigators it hired who are lawyers from these firms that are, employment law and so on firms. And then they come out with a decision saying that, your one tweet satirizing misgendering fatigue and the LGBTQ initialism, that violates 3 Mount Royal policies and 2 laws, the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the Human Rights Act. When I think that's a ridiculous finding that this lawyer came up with. But until you go and force it into the court system, it's going to stand. And you have to put up with all these kinds of very, very highly authoritarian kinds of tactics that
absolutely
lawyer is going to engage in.
Absolutely. Sort of linked or developing from there, I mean, when I was just having a look at your work, you're sort of described as a Marxist economist, and the article that you spoke about for the Canadian Political Association, there's a historical material thread running through that. So you probably see yourself on the left politically. I see myself on the left politically, and probably quite far to the left, certainly in redistributive terms. But something strange has happened. You become the regressive forces, don't you, in this current sort of climate where people who have never had a political thought actually want to sort of ascribe political positions to you or I. Or
yes, well, the term is alt-right that you hear thrown about.
Alt-right,
So I don't call myself a Marxist because I see that as almost as a religious kind of designation. And people say, here's a quote from Karl Marx, and like your views are not consistent with that. So my view is that it should be, if it's going to stand, it has to be scientifically valid, would be my position. And the theory is historical materialism, which is basically tracing the development of humanity in terms of productivity and relations of ownership. So it sees that, first of all, there's a tendency of productive forces to develop, which I think most people would see as being self-evident, right? We had, hunting and gathering and Stone Age technology, and then we developed, iron and so on, and productivity increased, and then productivity resulted in certain groups, a certain group being able to own what was called the means of production. And then the argument is that that's pretty much the basis of conflict that we see in society, is these kinds of ownership arrangements that exist. But I'm a person who's very academically oriented and not activist. Like I don't
Yeah.
have an activist kind of
Mm.
personality. So I'm just interested in the theory and whether the theory is, and it seems to me to have a lot of truth to it. The most important theory in historical materialism is the labor theory of value. And that to me, is the question that we should really be talking about all the time, which is the labor theory of value true or not? And I think that, political economists who are liberal and who are, what would be called, I guess, neoclassical economists, they would say, no, labor theory of value is false, whereas historical materialists would say, no, labor theory of value is true. That's the argument that needs to be had in I think, in political economy. But what's happened is that reified postmodernism, which started out in the postmodernism relativist position, started out in the 60s as an anti-enlightenment kind of force, which really attacked science and reason and logic, evidence-based forms of discussion. So that kind of took root in the academy. And then we had that kind of allowed identity politics to enter into the academy. And then identity politics took over the machinery of universities. And that's where we are right now, where really you have to accept the views of people who belong to groups who are perceived to be oppressed. So that's kind of what's happening. And if you don't accept that the residential schools are genocidal, or that a person who is born male who thinks that they're a woman is a woman, and or if you don't accept that Islam is the religion of peace, and like all these kinds of highly contentious claims, if you don't accept them, you must be pushed out of the university because you're inconsistent with, empowering people who are trying to overcome their oppression. So to me, that's kind of what's happened, is that the left used to be associated with class politics. That was kind of the major kind of left wing kind of thing. Now it's all about trans activism and decolonization and all these kinds of things which aren't really kind of rooted in, the working class. And actually many are kind of contrary to class politics. That's kind of what's taken over all people who now claim that they are, left wing in their orientation.
Yeah, and one of the things I picked up from that article was this notion of parallelism, and a consequence of when you start to see, people as groups and competing groups, then you actually fail to see that sort of potential or possibility of a more human connection, don't you? And I think we've created all these groups who are vying for position. It's a dystopian sort of prospectus that everybody's fighting with one another.
Yeah, so, and that's kind of identity politics. So identity politics, and people see it as kind of being anti-capitalist, is sort of how it's portrayed, is that this is kind of, and people like Douglas Murray, I'm not sure if you've read Douglas Murray's work, which has a lot of very valid arguments that are being put forward in it. But one thing I totally disagree with Douglas Murray on is that he sees this as all kind of just a reformed Marxism kind of thing that's happened, when I see it as actually as an attack on historical materialism, because they've gotten rid of the class basis for everything, and it's all now these kind of identity groups that are all vying for access to, positions within the capitalist system. So it's really not kind of anti-capitalist. It's really arguing that capitalism should remain. It's just that those who take positions in the kind of the managerialist kinds of areas, and board positions and so on, this should proportionately represent, various ethnicities and gender and so on. That's kind of the argument. So we're going to keep the capitalist system, we're just going to turn it over to groups who have been perceived to be oppressed, and then somehow they're going to run capitalism in a way that's going to be much kinder and gentler than what's happened with white people running capitalism, or whatever was kind of the argument. There's actually a political economist, I'm not sure if you've heard of her, she's excellent work. She actually was someone who I studied in great detail for my theories. Her name's Elizabeth Rada.
No.
And her book was called The Political Economy of Neo-Tribal Capitalism.
Yeah.
And so she sees like these developments that have happened in capitalism as have these neo-tribal characteristics, which is basically bringing ethnicity, kind of retribalizing various things within the capitalist system. And when capitalism was in its heyday in the 1950s, one of the good things about capitalism was it kind of detribalized. So although it still had the problems of capitalism, in terms of ownership and so on, it had this kind of liberal view of individual rights and people being equal under the law and these sorts of things. So that was kind of capitalism in its heyday. Now we have all these kinds of tribalistic things that have been brought into capitalism. So now we're getting rid of liberal ideas like the presumption of innocence and all these sorts of things, and having these kinds of tribal types of characteristics inserted in.
No, absolutely. I can't help but feel that we're being taken for a ride. But I'm conscious of David Harvey's book on neoliberalism, and the fact that if you create all these factions, then you're allowing the elite to continue to amass the wealth.
It's a
Nancy
distraction.
Fraser's idea of progressive neoliberalism, we're interested in pronouns while allowing the elite to cream off the the cash again. But,
I think that's what's happened to some extent, is that instead of focusing on the class politics, which is really at the root of what's going on, we've been distracted into looking at language. So there's this huge emphasis on language, which is just there's almost it seems to me there's almost the belief that we can create a better world through changing the language. So if we just spoke about things differently, then we can get rid of all the problems. And so, you just, if you don't want there to be oppression, well, you just stop people from using the word oppression. And then oppression will disappear and these sorts of things. So there's been this huge disconnect between the reality that exists and then the words that are used to describe that reality, and then saying somehow that by changing how we speak about reality, the reality can actually change, rather than focusing on no, it's the reality. That's the problem, is the reality. We got to change the reality. That's the problem. So I think there's a lot of this kind of happening, and everyone's so confused by all this discussion. They don't really know what's going on anymore, it seems to me.
Confused and silenced, I think, because, as you say, ideas such as decolonialization have become very big, and only a certain small groupings can actually claim those and run with them. Most faculty, certainly where I am, are scared to actually get into that because they think it's too complicated. They don't know the literature on it. So I think there seem to be small groups powerful groups within universities which drive these agendas, and others are scared to actually sort of engage with them because in case they're seen to be stupid or regressive or whatever.
That's certainly the case. Like the people thinking that they're just not intelligent enough, and like I've kind of given up trying to understand those really convoluted types of, whenever I see something written in that way, I just don't even bother with it anymore. Because, unless it's directly, I have to engage with it because of something I've written, because I can't, it just takes so much time. And then I've got all these questions, like there's all these kinds of almost definitional types of concerns that I don't quite understand what's being talked about. And more, I think that I'm just being bamboozled about.
Yeah.
I don't, maybe that's unfair. I don't know. There's lots of people argue with me about how, how incredibly insightful Foucault, Derrida, and Lacan are. It's like, well, I've tried to read these people, and I don't understand what they're talking about. And I'm sort of the opinion that, people should be able to explain something that is a very complex idea in very simple terms. I know we're not going to get the whole picture of it, but they should be able to give us a bit of a sense of what they're talking about. Simplified terms. And if they can't do that, then it's possible that there's nothing to what they're arguing. It's just an attempt to pull the wool over our eyes. Like, you need a certain amount of skepticism when you're looking at this highly, kind of convoluted forms of argumentation.
I mean, instinctively, I think there's probably something in all of these authors. It's just that when it becomes gospel rather than something that you can pick and mix from, and I think that's I find myself sort of between two stools on a number of these things, because I do think that some knowledge is socially constructed and there are power dynamics within how that happens. But it doesn't mean that there's nothing that you can sort of say is real.
Well, are you familiar with the work of Alan Sokal?
No.
So Alan Sokal, and I'm going to go back to Sokal again, because I think he's one of the best people to look at with respect to this situation, the postmodernist kinds of problems.
How do you spell his name?
Sokal. He's a physicist, and he's at New York University. Anyway, he wrote a book with actually, here's the book here. I'll just give a big plug for this book. Jean Bricmont was the co-author. Anyway, it's called Fashionable Nonsense. He wrote a hoax piece. It's got a famous hoax, which
I know
Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose has kind of sowed the groundwork for what those three. Anyway, Sokal wrote this piece where he basically made it up, pretending that postmodern theory, was a great way to understand some aspect of physics, which was just totally, he just pieced together a bunch of quotes from all these gurus of postmodernism. Anyway, Sokal made a very good point, and I think this is kind of what's going on with all the confusion. He said that there's a number of different levels when you're talking about knowledge. There's ontological questions and epistemological questions. So ontology is basically what objects exist in the universe. Epistemology is how can we make the knowledge claims that we do. So it's about the question of, truth or falsity of ideas. But then there's what he calls sociology of knowledge kinds of areas, which are the kinds of interests that are at work that make certain questions asked and others not asked, and so on, kinds of things. And what happens with postmodernism, according to him, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, is they're kind of conflating the sociology of knowledge kinds of problems with the epistemological problems. So the epistemology is really justified true belief and, the kinds of, evidence that you need to make the claim that you do, right? That really doesn't have anything to do with the interests that are involved in shaping research. And so his argument is we need to separate out those different levels and figure out whether we're talking about a sociology of knowledge type of concern or an epistemological kind of concern. So, and I think that postmodernism has confused this, which gets us distracted. And, and instead of kind of looking at, and it's true, how corporations do shape research through their funding types of decisions and so on, separate those kinds of concerns from sort of methodological types of concerns, which is your research design, have you accurately controlled for things, and all these kinds of questions that people who are doing scientific research have to be concerned about. So I think there's a lot of kind of this sort of smoke and mirrors that is happening in these kinds of things. And instead of criticizing funding and politics that are involved, we say science. There's something wrong with science. When there's nothing wrong with science. It's just that scientific research is often corrupted by various kinds of financial kinds of interests that exist in the world.
Yeah. And how have universities been seduced or caught up in this?
Yes, well, right now the big problem is the totalitarianism. So I think that's kind of what people have to really, all the kinds of, and it was like 15 years ago, so I've been in the university system. I guess I started my PhD in 1997. So I've kind of been watching things, for about 25 years. And it was really only, starting in the late 2000s that we were having, things began to really break down. So before that, we had identity politics, which was in the universities as one position amongst other positions. Now, I guess the question is there something about identity politics which makes it totalitarian? So was the totalitarianism that emerged in the late 2000s, was that an inevitable result of identity politics being in the universities? Or could we just kind of go back to a time when we had identity politics as one of the many kinds of ways in which people would study things? I'm not sure, that's still kind of an unknown situation. But one thing we need to do if we're going to save the universities, and whether they can be saved or not, I guess is the open question now, is we have to get it out of the administration. We have to get identity politics out of the administration. So all these diversity offices, decolonization, and indigenization policies, the LGBTQ safe space office, and all these kinds of administrative things which are trying to control how people interact with one another, those have to be removed from the university. So that's what's necessary right now. Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay suggest treating reified postmodernism as if it were a religion. So people go to the university, they can be any religion. No one's saying, you can't have religious beliefs if you're in the university. The individual disciplines, however, should not embrace religion. It should be a secular environment where you are free to make a case for whatever claim that you want to make a claim, but it's not going to be the official kind of position that, trans women are women, right? That's not an official position that you have to accept. You can make the argument if you want to say that trans women are women, but it cannot be demanded and compelled that you've got to accept that. And it was interesting you mentioning when we were discussing things, human rights, because human rights is a kind of the battering ram that's often used for this. So you're told that if you don't say that a person born male who now believes they're a woman is actually a woman, you are discriminating against that person, and you are violating their human rights by not accepting that. That kind of, and I think we're kind of battling this out in Canada. I don't know what's happening now in the UK with respect to this.
Yeah, I was just thinking there was a recent court case where, I can't remember the woman's name, but she had her case upheld, and
This is Kiera Bell, or this is Forrester, Maya Forrester?
I think it was Forster, that basically she had her belief that trans women were not women upheld as a fundamental belief, a philosophical belief. And I think that's where you get to with human rights, that one human right sort of clashes with another human right or a belief system or whatever else. So you're fighting all the time, you know. And see, I suppose that's where I get confused in some ways, that, you know, human rights is a global phenomenon. You know, I can see the Enlightenment attraction of that, if you like, but in practice, I think human rights are questionable, you know, both philosophically and in terms of the sort of how they play out in practice. I just think that we need some way of coming to some sort of agreement that we're going to disagree in some of these things. But we've become Manichaean in it, haven't we? You're either right or you're wrong.
Well, I think with the human rights kind of area, I think one place where we went off the rails is we used to be concerned with discrimination. So you shouldn't be discriminated against. And so we'd have these protections. And I think that is a completely acceptable type of, sort of position to take. And it's very, very beneficial that people should, if you're going to apply for a job, right, and you're a trans person, that should not be held against you in any kind of way, right? Unless there's something that has to do with your ability to do the job, like that should be how it's seen. Now, and this has happened in Canada, the law has slightly changed on these questions, and it's become from a non-discrimination kind of stance to an affirmation that you have to be affirmed. And in religion, this went from non-discrimination to what was called reasonably accommodate. So it's like this accommodation as opposed to just preventing discrimination. And as soon as we started entering into this affirmation, celebration, accommodation kind of line, this is what then started to cause the problems, because then you got into all these kinds of messy arguments about, what does that mean and so on. And in the case of many of these identity kind of groups, we're now, especially the trans issue, trans activism is where you see this at its most kind of extreme, where now things are being demanded of other people to kind of recognize something about that person. And the pronouns issue, like the pronouns discussions, were what was kind of beginning to manifest themselves. And this happened in Canada, and I don't know what the status in the UK. We started to see this very, very clearly in, I guess it was 2016. And that's when there was a bill in a piece of legislation in Ontario that was saying that if someone wanted you to use your pronouns, you'd have to use them. And if you didn't, you would be breaking the law. Jordan Peterson, that was started on the whole Jordan Peterson phenomenon, as Jordan Peterson said, no, this is compelled speech. That should not be part of legislation. And that kind of compulsion, that kind of aspect of this compulsion, that's kind of where I think this totalitarian kind of element of these things has come in, right? So, you
Yeah.
know, if you want to use, you're allowed to use whatever pronouns you want, like go ahead, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
like, do you have the right to expect other people
Yeah.
to have to use those pronouns like
Yeah.
that? And especially these pronouns that it's not just like, you know, someone who looks like a he wants to be called a she. That's not even the whole thing. It's someone's made up all these things which are really hard to remember and everything, and you're supposed to, you know, put this list
Yeah.
of these different made up pronouns along all your class. And then now it is, well, it's changeable, so they could
Yeah.
be a zir in the morning and a purse in the afternoon, and you've got to change your class list. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No.
This is
Madness.
not, this seems to me to be entering into forcing other people to do things
Yeah. Yeah.
on, you know, sort of, it's kind of highly questionable kinds of developments that are happening with respect to that.
Okay, we should maybe draw to a close then. I think that's been fascinating.
It has, yes.
Yeah.
So in terms of, maybe I should just give you the last word to say what, anything you think has been omitted, or what you're currently working on, or where people can find out more about your work.
Yeah. What I'm currently working, I've just completed a book actually, which is about the experiences of boys I looked after in the 1980s in a residential school. Basically, I sort of taken the view that, you know, we need to get different stories out there, more finely grained histories. So I've got the life histories of 7 boys I looked after, all of whom tell incredibly positive stories of their time in a residential school. A residential school, as I say, run by a religious order. And it really tells a very different story from the sort of dominant one, which is put out there about the residential schools and about residential care in particular. And the other thing I'm working on just now are these critiques of trauma, because I think that sort of notion of therapeutic notion actually drives a lot of very punitive sort of social policies and criminal justice policies. It legitimates you know, a more punitive response to situations than would otherwise be the case. So yeah, those are the kind of current projects.
Anyway, so much, I'd like to thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. I wanted to thank you for appearing on the Rational Space Disputations.
Thank you for having me.